I'm Cierra Bettens. This is APTN News InFocus. On this episode, why food insecurity has hit a breaking point in Nunavut. When we think about health and social issues in the North, food insecurity is among the most pressing. Healthy, nutritious meals for families in remote communities are expensive and at times out of reach. Access to country foods like seal and caribou can be equally elusive. These persistent issues led one researcher to declare that Nunavut is in a food security crisis. It's a crisis that Dr. Sindhu Govindapillai, the executive director of the Arctic Children and Youth Foundation, described as the worst she's seen. According to 2022 data by Statistics Canada, 79% of children under 14 in Nunavut lived in situations of food insecurity. And the food center in Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, says it's on course to serve 70,000 meals this year. So with that, coupled with the impacts of climate change and inflation, the issue is trending upwards. APTN News reporter Jesse Staniforth has written extensively on the issue, and he joins me from Montreal to share more. Jesse, thanks so much for joining us on InFocus.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Jesse, let's start by describing the problem in Nunavut. What are some of the things that are contributing to the food crisis?
I think the number one thing that contributes to the food crisis in Nunavut is the disparity between household income and the cost of food, no matter which way you get that food. And I think everybody is familiar with the incredibly high costs of groceries. But what I think people may not be aware of is that in many, many cases, many Inuit across Nunavut are just simply not getting enough income to meet those high prices. And so I think a lot of Canadians may be under the impression that, we've accounted for that. We figured out how to give folks up north enough money to account for the disparity in prices. But this is often not the case. And in fact, one of the most striking things that I heard on a couple of occasions from a couple of people is that you could have a household income of over $100,000, and that's often not enough to feed everybody. And that's, I think, a fairly striking figure for people in the South who, normally with $100,000, you can at least have enough food, but that's a challenge in a lot of places in Nunavut.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also curious, with this story that was published earlier this week, how did you first get on the story? It's pretty extensive and you did a lot of research and, this has been ongoing, but how did this come to you specifically this time around?
Well, there was a press conference at the end of September at a community food center, which is kind of like a soup kitchen in Iqaluit. And the director there, a fellow by name of Joseph Murdoch Flowers, talked about how in the preceding week, there had been a single day where 8% of the entire population of Iqaluit had come in to get a hot meal. And I'm from Montreal, and I thought, 8%, if 8% of Montreal came to get a hot meal someplace, that would be about 300,000 people. And so I was very struck by that. And I was also very struck by another person who spoke at that press conference, Dr. Sindhu Govindapillai, who's a pediatrician who's worked on a lot of hunger issues. And she was talking about the problem in Iqaluit of the enormous gap between the poverty line, which I think she placed somewhere in the high $80,000, and the amount of money that people get on social assistance, which is, I don't think, any more than $40,000. And she was saying, there's this massive gap, and it needs to be filled. Otherwise, people are going to starve. And I wrote about that press conference when it happened, and my editor, Mark Blackburn, and I were talking about it, and we began talking about a toolkit that came out of Yellowhead Institute, and this was the Iqaluit Food Sovereignty Toolkit. And this was a package that the Yellowhead Institute put together in effect to encourage Inuit to get on the land and hunt country food. And they gave some what they call masterclass videos with elders instructing how to, for example, hunt seal and butcher it and prepare it and cache the meat on the land for fermenting, all these sorts of things. And from that, we learned about, this was an offshoot of a greater project called Iqaluit that was a number of academics had put together to look at the issue of food sovereignty in the North. And so once I began talking to those people, I think I wasn't expecting it to be as much about hunger, but everybody I talked to talked about the fact that there was hunger, and this is the key issue. I mean, I thought maybe we'd be having more measured conversations about, okay, well, what makes, food sovereignty and such. And what I was hearing from a lot of people, in fact, was there are emergencies and people are not getting enough to eat.
And so you open your story by introducing us to the Katzak family who hunted a large and a small seal. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that. Because, after reading the story, it's very indicative of the food security problem in Nunavut.
I had the enormous privilege of speaking with a woman named Rhoda Katzak, who is an elder in Pond Inlet. And she was part of the Iqaluit project as a co-investigator. But more importantly, she and her husband, I believe his name is Joshua, they are the ones who did the teaching for the master classes, and they want to encourage people to eat country food. And so she was talking about how she taught her children, her son and her grandchildren to hunt, and she shared a story about how her son went out and got a small seal and a large seal. And small seal, I'm a Southerner, so I didn't know this, but small seal is very, very tender. The meat is very good. People are very happy about it. A large seal, it's not as good to eat. And she said that, they spent a few days eating the small seal, really enjoyed it. It was a good meal, or a series of good meals. And then they looked at this large seal and they said, well, we're going to have to make sure we get rid of every part of this. And the initial thought was, well, it'll work as dog food. Nobody's really going to want to eat a big seal, but everybody's got dogs. The dogs will be happy. This will be great. And Rhoda said that her husband said, let's just put this on Facebook. Someone will come in and get the meat for the dogs. And she said within about 10 minutes, people had claimed all of the meat for themselves. And she said there was no question. Everybody was going to be eating this because it was all they could get at the moment. And that just really struck me, because we often talk about the centrality of country food to Northern Indigenous cultures. And, when we're speaking about Inuit in particular, this is a culture ancestrally where there is virtually nothing that isn't meat in people's ancestral diet, and it's country meat. So not being able to access this specific food that has kept Inuit nourished for thousands of years is genuinely striking, and it's a huge problem. It's frightening.
And related to that, you spoke with Dr. Amy Kahi, who's a public health nutritionist. In the article, she makes a distinction between food security, which is the state of being able to access food, versus food sovereignty, which is the state of being able to eat culturally relevant food and that people enjoy eating and want to eat. Why do you think this is an important distinction in the context of this story?
This is something I think that goes back to, and we didn't touch on this in the article, but I have covered things related to the Indian residential schools genocide over the past 12 years. And one of the more striking stories that I heard from a number of survivors was the fact that people who went to residential school were not, they weren't taught to cook. They weren't taught how to put together nourishing meals. They weren't taught to do very many things, really. And this was all part of attempting to destroy these ancestral cultures and to force people to accept the food offered by Europeans. And this isn't even really an option in the North, because Southern food is so hard to get, considering how expensive it is and stuff. There's this importance to being able to access traditional food, country food, that is, I think it's much greater the farther north you get, because this is about accessing an ancestral lineage of food and being able to continue eating the things that kept your ancestors alive this long. In the South, people eat a whole variety of things, but in the North, people have been much more limited by the availability of what there is. And what there is country food. What there is seal and whale and caribou and fish and walrus and so forth. These are incredibly central foods, and when you go into, I'm not an Inuk, and but I've done a lot of reading on Inuit issues, spent a lot of time with Inuit, and there's always stories of food. This is the central motivating structure of a lot of the things that people talk about in any Inuit community, is being able to get good food and being able to feed their families. And it's really genuinely shocking that people are not able to access the country food that's right there on their doorstep.
We know how important country food is in this context, but, access is a whole other thing. What are some barriers to that?
Well, in a sense, anybody can access a seal. If you have the means to get to where the seal is, if you happen to be living in a place like Pond Inlet, it's not that hard to find a seal. What it's hard to do is to pay for a rifle and to pay for cartridges, and it costs a lot to buy the ski-doo that takes you out to the edge of the ice floe to find the seal, and it costs a lot to get a sled to pull behind your ski-doo to bring that meat back home. And on top of that, there's the price of gasoline, right? All of these things are massively inflated as prices when you are looking at the far north. And it makes it impossible to access food that's, in many cases, right on people's doorsteps. The food is right there and they could be looking at it. But if you don't have the means to hunt and butcher and prepare and preserve that meat, then you can't get at it. And it's that this is the quandary that's at the center of this story, is that people have the food there. It's right there. It's just being able to afford to hunt it is the issue.
And so the government's proposed, partial solution to this issue is to put in place food programs. And I want to start with the Inuit Child First Initiative's Hamlet Food Voucher Program. Can you talk a bit about what that is and how it worked?
It was a temporary program that ran for about 3 years, and it was intended to give, and it did give families $500 per child per month for food, and then an additional $250 per child under 4 for diapers. And that it was intended to supplement what I mentioned earlier, which is the fact that there's this enormous gap between what's available on social assistance and the actual poverty line.
And so when that program was in place, was it effective, would you say?
Well, I suppose it depends on whom you ask, but I spoke with Jessica Penny, who is she was the lead for the Yellowhead Institute's Iqaluit toolkit, and she was also one of the co-investigators on the original Iqaluit project. And she is she's an Inuk from Labrador who grew up in Iqaluit, and she told me, the basic measure of effectiveness was that families were being fed, children were being fed, and people appeared happy. And that's a pretty strong measure. Now, there's other ways I think you could probably quantify that. I have no idea, frankly, about what the Government Indigenous Services Canada felt about the effectiveness of the program. But regardless of that, they ended the program at the end of March of this year. And they did continue the Inuit Child First Initiative, which is the Inuit version of Jordan's Principle. That has been continued for one more year, at least. But the Hamlet Food Voucher Program just simply ended nearly overnight. And when it ended, I have heard from people, frankly, and pretty much everyone I spoke to said that the sudden loss of food income was striking, and it had an incredible effect in that it immediately led to situations in which people were skipping meals in order to keep their children fed.
Mm-hmm. And so the federal government also brought in the Nutrition North program, which is a program that APTN has covered a lot. But can you explain how that works?
Right. So Nutrition North was a program that came in 2011 under Stephen Harper. And the idea was that it was an attempt to address the incredible cost of food in the North. And they wanted to bring down the prices of food. And the way that they elected to do that was to provide subsidies to food retailers. And they would give extra money to food retailers. And the hope was that the food retailers would bring down their prices as a result. Now, I spoke with a couple of researchers that have worked on Nutrition North in detail, and they told me, well, it did do a lot of those things. It's a controversial program. There have been a lot of opinions expressed about it, but in certain senses, the issue that they often talk about is the pass-throughs. How much of every dollar that's spent on Nutrition North goes through to the consumer. And I spoke with a researcher named Nicholas Lee from Toronto who worked on this program, and he said that overall it's about 67 cents on the dollar that gets passed through to the consumer. And that's not it's not a dollar, but it's better than nothing. And it does mean that people's food prices are going down. But generally speaking, the food prices come down in a circuitous way that retailers get money, and then in some cases hunting groups may be funded. But the money does not go direct to individual hunters, and it doesn't go direct to the average Inuit food buyer. You're hoping when you go to the store that the prices will be lower because of the nutrition program, but you're not going to get a check in the mail from it.
Mm-hmm. And I understand you also posed some questions to the government for the story. Can you tell us what they were?
Well, understanding why the Hamlet Food Voucher Program ended, simply because everybody that I spoke to premised it as a really central point in this descent into struggle over food. So I wanted to speak with them and get their reasoning for why they chose to end that program at the end of March. And I also wanted to talk to them about whether or not they have plans to address the hunger emergency, or what people are calling a hunger emergency. In order to do that, I needed to ask them whether there was a hunger emergency. And Indigenous Services Canada really did not address any of these issues. They wouldn't agree to an interview, so they wanted me to send questions by email, which I did, and they sent me a response that really didn't address a lot of what I asked. And what I was trying to get some information about, and I haven't been able to get from them, is whether they believe there is a hunger crisis going on in Nunavut, and subsequent to that, whether they have a plan to do something about what's being called a hunger crisis. Is there an emergency plan? Is something going to be done to deal with the absence following the Hamlet Food Voucher Program? And I really got very little in the way of clear response. The response that I did get was that the Hamlet Food Voucher Program was never intended to be a long-term solution in the first place. They described it effectively as being sort of like a Band-Aid solution, and they didn't think that it would make sense for long-term investment into Band-Aid solutions. And they are focused on what they think of as really long-term approaches, like the Nutrition North program, and I think their aim is to improve the Nutrition North program, but they are trying to come up with global long-term solutions that will have some character other than simply giving people money for food. Now, that is not necessarily what people have asked for, the people on the ground. I mean, particularly Sindhu Govindipele, Dr. Sindhu Govindipele in Iqaluit talked about the incredible power of simply giving people money with which to buy food. And she talked about the fact that there is a large variety of studies out there that show that when people in the north get money, they immediately spend it on food. And when they get a good amount of money, they immediately spend it on meat, and they immediately spend it on country food if country food is available, and they immediately spend it on, if they have extra, they spend it on hunting tools and vehicles, right? People invest in food first. And so what Dr. Govindipele really talked about was, if we simply were to give people money directly, there's a high likelihood that they would spend it on nourishing food for their families. And so that's what she and several other people that I spoke with have suggested is the best means of combating a food crisis in Nunavut. That I'm not sure what Indigenous Services thinks of that idea. And it may well be that they agree entirely and they're working on a program to meet that, but they didn't give me any indication of where they were going with this.
Jesse, that's all the time we have, but thank you so much for coming on the podcast and giving us a closer look at this issue.
I really appreciate you being able to take the time to ask me the questions. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it, so thank you very much.
Today's episode was produced by Mark Blackburn and edited by Jesse Andrushko. Charmaine Straker is executive producer of APTN News InFocus. If you're liking the show, please leave a review. And if you have any comments or ideas, email them to infocus@aptn.ca. For more APTN News podcasts, visit aptnnews.ca or find us on your favorite player. I'm Cierra Bettens. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next week.
Homeless people aren't hard to find in Winnipeg. They're on the sidewalks, in bus shelters, and down alleyways. They're living in tents and squatting in empty buildings. They're even sleeping in abandoned cars. But who are they? And why are they here? Find out in Our Relatives, Life on the Streets, hosted by me, Kathleen Martins. Listen on your favorite podcast player.